Hello, hello. Welcome. I'm delighted that you all have chosen to stop by this evening and sit with me for a bit. And as I talk about eating while Black, and I'm not sure if this is going to work because it's okay. There we go. Eating while Black, food shaming and race in America. Um, I am Psyche Williams-Forson. Um, I'm a professor at the University of Maryland in the Department of American Studies. I'm also chair of that department. And I have been doing this work in food studies for, a good 25 years now, I think. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation. So what I thought we would do is I will, of course, talk about the book, but I want to keep it open and make it a discussion. So I'm not lecturing or anything. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the book and why I wrote it and what it contains and show you some images. But if you have questions at any time or you want to jump in and share something, feel free to do that, okay? So let me get my slides here and get them going. All right, so I decided to write Eating While Black because my first book, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power, had afforded me the opportunity to travel throughout the United States and globally sharing what I had learned about Black people and I mean Black people, sort of African diaspora, and our engagement with foods like fried chicken or chicken in general. And so as I was doing that, a lot of things were happening in society at that time. For one, we were in a sort of late 20th century, early 21st century counterculture, if you will, of gardening. Gardening had resurged. And
you are in part 14.
Oh, wait, I think somebody's not muted. So gardening had resurged and folks were really coming to my talk about my book to understand more about gardening and how to start community gardens and so forth. Another thing that was happening though was refrigeration started to come into Dollar Tree and other dollar markets. And I had a young child at the time, 2 or 3, and every single time we had a birthday party, we needed something, so we would frequent the Dollar Tree to try and get all of these kinds of products. Okay, so those things were happening, but as people were coming up to me while I was talking about,
you're in there now.
As people were talking coming to my talk, a lot of times they were saying things like, well, you have to really grow your own food. That's the best thing you can do. And so I started to detect a moralism that was attached to these discussions around food, right? Like if you're not growing your own food, you're just not wise and you're not smart and you're not eating healthy and so forth. The other thing that started happening was we began to get this phrase called "I eat clean," right? As if you don't eat clean, does that mean the rest of us eat dirty, right? So essentially, I began to see a lot of food shaming, which we know goes on all the time in every culture. But around Black folks in particular, I started to see this shaming in a lot of different spaces, and it was normalized to the point where it was invisible, right? And so I wrote Eating While Black because it was a series of talks that I had been giving over time, and I wanted to pull them together to sort of talk about the power of food to tell stories, right? And so this book is really a sort of storytelling, series of storytelling through food, because I'm sharing with you very particular experiences I have had or instances where I see food shaming taking place in Black communities. I start always with this piece from Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie, whose work I discovered many years ago. It's a TED Talk, and if you don't know it, I would urge you to take a look at it. It's called The Danger of the Single Story. It's about 15 minutes. And she essentially tells she basically says the single story creates stereotypes, right? And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they're incomplete, right? They make one story become the only story. And I love this quote because it's so indicative of what I find about conversations around Black food cultures, and in particular, just about food in general, but especially about Black food cultures. One of the things I try to remind people is that food is intensely personal, right? We know this it's sort of abstractly, but I don't think you know it to the point where if I say to you, if you come in your house today and all your furniture is gone, you're going to freak out, right? Somebody has violated your space. For undergraduate students or graduate students who I deal with on a daily basis, I use the example, if I take your cell phone, it's going to throw you into a tizzy, right? So for a lot of people, food is that way, right? Because we have been cultivating and evolving our food cultures for decades in some instances, and certainly at the very least for many years. So telling folks that their foods are wrong and bad, not good, they're unhealthy, we really have to unpack that, especially when you're talking about Black people, because there are lots of different things that I talk about in the book that we overlook when we have those conversations. For one, we overlook Black food culture just in general, right? And these images I'm about to show you next are partly from my first book, and what they're reminiscent of is some of the ways in which Black folks have literally had to live with stereotypes involving food. Here's the Coon Chicken Inn. It was a restaurant out in the Midwest in 3 different locations. You'll see here the mouth of this sort of caricature of a Black man with big wide lips and bulging eyes. And this restaurant was absolutely in existence, and made lots of money. We also had stereo views in cards where showing, this is back in the early 20th century, showing this huge consternation that this man has between chicken and watermelon. So when folks say that they aren't familiar with those stereotypes, these stereotypes of Black people, watermelon and chicken have been around for hundreds of years. Even more recent, if you are through Natchez, Mississippi, you will still find Mammy's Cupboard, which was founded in 1940. It's a roadside restaurant built in the shape of a Mammy archetype. And then even more recent, when President Obama won his office in the first year, this kind of advertisement circulated widely throughout the internet, and lots of different restaurants in their attempts to play homage to the president actually played on some real long-standing stereotypes, right? So this is what Adichie means by the single story. A lot of folks know Black folks' food cultures to be related to things like chicken, bacon, grits, fries, turkey, scrapple. Now, here's the thing. There's a part of truth there, right? Because the majority of Black folks came to this country through the mouth of enslavement, through the South, and a lot of these foods happen to be cooked in the South. They're very well seasoned, over seasoned, heavily seasoned, whatever adjective you want to use. So that's what Adichie means by the problem with a single story is it's not that it's not true, it's that it's incomplete, right? So I take that premise and I use it to remind people that alongside Indigenous peoples, Africans were the original folks to come to this country with a lot of knowledge of agriculture, right? In fact, the reasons they were brought to this country had to do with their agricultural knowledge. Gardening, plant life, and so forth. Part of the narrative that comes out of enslavement that a lot of people want to talk about is, oh, all Black folks' foodways derived from scraps. Okay, that's not true, not at all. And partly it's not true, we know, because you had enslaved folks who were Muslim, who continued to practice their religion well throughout the time of their life in enslavement. Then, of course, you had chefs that, like folks have talked about today, Chef Hercules Posey, who were classically trained, we can't assume that folks who worked in kitchens didn't talk to other people on the plantation, right? And if you're surrounded at all by water, if you're surrounded by forestry and you have knowledge, agricultural knowledge of how to identify herbs and plants and berries and nuts, you're going to eat from the land in a very useful kind of way. So I talk about all of that and the ways in which this notion of shame unfolds, right? In the book. I start the book with a story that happened in Washington, D.C., where a woman, a Black metropolitan metro worker, was eating on the train, and someone took a picture of her and posted it on Twitter and really sort of berated her. As it turns out, and she berated her because she said, you know, we're not supposed to eat on the train. As it turns out, this metro worker who worked for Metro knew the rules had changed only recently and was eating in between shifts or on her way to her next destination. But my question there was, what would possess a person to take a picture? What would possess a woman of color to take a picture of another woman of color and post it online? And part of my argument is that that is a function of anti-Black racism. It's a function of anti-Black racism to assume that you know more than the person who's living their life. It's possible you do, but it's also very possible you don't know anything at all about this person's life who you are now viewing as you pass by them on a public transportation. That whole concept of anti-Black racism is teased out in the first chapter through a theory that I was introduced to by Melissa Harris Perry, where she talks about most Black folks in America live in a crooked room and are perched on a crooked chair. And we're always trying to balance the chair so that we're upright, not realizing we'll never be upright because the chair isn't the problem. The problem is the room. The system is not built for you. So when you try to conform to that system, you're going to always be off kilter. So I give you some examples of that in the text around food. For example, I'll say very quickly, I was at Eric Schlosser came to the University of Maryland. Eric Schlosser was the author of, I think, Super Size Me, where he criticized how we are getting, heavier because we're eating larger portions of food, et cetera. So after he gave his talk, most of which he advocated for eating locally and so forth and so on, several Black women, at least 3, got up and gave their testimony about how they had changed their diets, et cetera. At the end of the last one, he essentially told her that her actions were extreme. She had told him, I had stopped drinking milkshakes because I didn't want all of those preservatives and chemicals in my body, and I was getting these milkshakes from public venues. Well, here she was looking for affirmation, right, of having changed her diet, affirmation that she was doing the right thing. And instead of receiving that affirmation, she actually was more or less told that she was exaggerating because her actions were extreme. So that's the kind of thing that I mean when I say you're balancing on a crooked chair in a crooked room. You're not going to get validation from people who don't understand perhaps that you were trying to also stop drinking milkshakes because you have fibroids, right? Or something of that nature. So I talk about that, and then I move into this notion of how we have used religion to also keep Black folks in a space where we see ourselves as victims in this life, and therefore we don't often necessarily move outside of that. I'm not saying all Black people, of course, but I'm saying there are many who buy into this notion that by being good people, good citizens, you can then be accepted in American society. Reverend Dr. John Howard Wesley, who's the pastor of Alpha Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, gave a sermon over COVID. And this particular piece caught my attention, right? As I was watching him one morning, he talked about sacralization. And sacralization is when you tie a narrative to scripture to justify its existence. And in this particular case, he was talking about the curse of Ham. And I'm not sure if many of you have heard of this notion, but essentially, after Noah and the ark, right? After they landed, Noah was very wealthy. He had vineyards and so forth, and he got drunk, right? And he got drunk and passed out, and his sons covered him up. And when he came to, there's this belief that was used throughout enslavement that God cursed Ham and the descendants of Ham, and Black people are the descendants of Ham. And so what Pastor Wesley says is this notion of sacralization. And he says, by believing that you are called by God in these different ways, you can oppress other kinds of groups because you believe in the curse of Ham, and you have used that single story, right, to keep people oppressed and to keep them believing that they are somehow not at all whole and human. So I deal with that, and I come back to this notion that, but Black people have always done phenomenal things with food. Here, I'll show you a couple of images of Black women. This woman here was at the train station in Richmond selling rolls and chicken legs, right? These are the women of Gordonsville, Virginia, who I talk about in my first book, who are considered the first Black female entrepreneurs in that county. And they were here selling chicken and many other foodstuffs to passengers as they passed by the town of Gordonsville. You also had this woman, Julia Brown, who made her living as a chicken vendor. And so I talk about the ways in which Black women have done amazing things with food that is in contradiction to this single story narrative. And it wasn't just Black women, it was also Black men who cooked. And even here at Craig Field Air Force Base, when they weren't allowed to fight, the way that they contributed to American patriotism was through cooking. And then, of course, we know of the resiliency of Black people during the Montgomery bus boycott, who would prefer to walk rather than drive on public or ride on public transportation in order to get to wherever they had to go. So what I try to show are these stories of resiliency around food or with food that contradict these narratives, like the one you saw early on of these stereotypical images, and contradict these stories that Black folks are somehow oppressed and cursed by Ham, oppressed by the curse of Ham. This is an image of the Ebony Test Kitchen, which was on display in New York City for a long time this summer. So many different recipes had passed through the test kitchen. This whole piece was part of the Museum of Food and Drinks exhibition on African American culinary identity. There was a legacy quilt that went along with this exhibition. So I use these things in my presentation to sort of talk a little bit about the ways in which Black folks, despite this realm of shaming, have pushed through and continue to do the work that we do in our homes, in our communities, et cetera. These next couple of slides are going to tell you, have to do with a young woman who I feature in the book, who very much put me in the mind of my daughter, who in her third or fourth grade was told alongside the other children in her class to stand on the scale, and then the teacher read their weight out loud, and then told them, many of you won't make it because you're obese, right? Disregarding the fact that we're in a largely majority Black county, the largest county in the United States, where you have lots of young people who are differently figured, right? Because they have hips and they have breasts that come in just like their family members over generations, Black and Latina children. And so around the time that my daughter was coming through that type of horrific experience and traumatizing experience, I came across the story of this young lady, Latricia Avery. And Latricia, it was featured in the Washington Post alongside other children to talk about young lives at risk and specifically around obesity. And so I was so taken by her story. And Latricia would now probably be, in her mid to late 20s. But I just want to scroll through these pictures so that you can take a quick look at Latricia, because I do an entire read on the expose and the ways in which, in their attempts to say they're focusing on these young people of all races, in effect, really do put this young Black woman, they shame her, quite frankly, in the worst of ways. So they give us these pictures and narrative, as you can see here in the corner. They have these little captions about Latricia. I do a read about the ways in which they juxtapose her, you see. So Latricia was teased throughout. At 12, she was teased at school, and she was called King Kong because she was 5'7", weighed 220 pounds. This image serves really to juxtapose and overemphasize the difference in height and weight between these young girls. And there are more images that I show in the or talk about in the narrative in the book. Here's Latricia at lunch. Here she is at home, and with this little guy here who is unnamed. And as I look around the table, there's lots of place settings, but right now we're focused on Latricia. So we find out in this story that Latricia is living with a caregiver, not her parents, not her grandparents. In fact, I believe her grandmother had passed away. The article goes on to focus on, for example, her portion sizes and the food that she eats, and really demonizes her and says, hey, part of it is because you live in an area where you're beset by liquor stores and fast food restaurants, right? And so here we see this image of Latricia eating a salad, and she's picking out the raw broccoli, right? And the article says, she doesn't really want to eat these fresh, healthy vegetables, right? So there are a couple of things that the article goes on to do. They have her aunt or her caregiver saying, well, she just lacks determination and willpower, right? It's a 12-year-old girl. She lacks a lot of things at 12, right? And so what the article does is it hints at different parts of her life, but of course, it is never their intention to delve into those parts of her life. And so my daughter's experience and this young girl's experience lead me to ask, what don't we know about Latricia that's contributing to where she is and how she looks, right? So for example, if you go back and take a look at that first picture in this series, I noticed that she's spilling out of her bra, right? And when I look very closely at her clothes, it looks like she's wearing the same outfit every day. And then I have to beg the question, where's her mom? Even though her mom is mentioned at one point in the article, where is she on a regular basis? Where's her dad? Where are her grandparents? And I began to ask myself, could Latricia be actually in a foster care situation, right? Because she's living with a caretaker. And despite the fact that this young girl is living this trauma, right? Because we know there's some trauma there. The article never at all deals with that. It focuses in on the fact that this young girl who's trying to eat foods that are part of her cultural lifeways is obese. Even though they mention that she helps her caretaker to cook these foods, and she has learned to sew, and she's learned all these other things. Our focus is supposed to be on the amount of food she's eating, which allegedly they eat once a week. But we want to believe that she's better off eating foods that are like this, where she's going to pick the ingredients out, versus telling her, well, maybe you can cut back on your portions, or maybe we can cook it this way, or what have you. Right. And then one of the things that I'm really upset about in this, and that probably comes across in my discussion of Latricia, is we don't need this right here. We don't need this young girl on the floor grimacing, doing exercises that she probably will never like for the rest of her life. And I said, have we connected, did the Washington Post or anyone connect this young girl to organizations like Girls on the Run, right? Where it teaches young girls to get out and do all kinds of exercises at all times of the day, or Black Girls Run, right? Because there's this other single story out there that Black women don't like to exercise. And of course, this is as far from true as anything else. There are lots of organizations, as I just showed you, the Black Marathoners Association, there's Girls on the Run, you've got Black Girls Run, you've got Girl Trek. You know, one of the reasons Black Girls Run was established is because people in their family had diabetes and they wanted to begin to shift their life. And so, you know, Black girls do run, right? And we're not always super thin, right? We may be full figure, but we do exercise and we do get out there. And so again, part of my reason for writing this book is to open up these conversations that we tend to foreclose on by making assumptions about people's lives, right? And so I say to Latricia, it's not necessary for you to give up the corn pudding. You might just have to eat less of it, or you may have to cook it differently. But these are your cultural life ways. You should not have to give up your food in order to be able to live a life and thrive. I end the book by talking about eating farmers markets and the like. Some of us absolutely do grow our food, right? This was my former neighbor in Buffalo, New York, Ms. Shipman, and you can see the beautiful mustard green she has here that's overflowing on the side of her house, which is amazing because we're in Buffalo, right? And the fact that she's able to grow this wonderful produce. But not all of us do. And some of us do frequent farmers markets. And so I do a whole read on an experience I had visiting this farmer's market, which was actually set up to attract African-American people who had been displaced through gentrification. And the market didn't go into the Black community, it was on the outside of the Black community. And the expectation was that Black folks would come to this market. Well, I took the liberty of taking some pictures because these kinds of foods, even though the market takes SNAP, it was very clear to me that nobody was going to be able to afford these who was on SNAP, right? You're just not eating free range eggs for $5, you know, on a SNAP card when your entire allotment is maybe $80 or what have you. And you're probably not going to be able to afford the pasture raised pork or the grass fed beef, which could run you upwards of $50 at any given market. And so what I do is I talk a little bit about something I call Black food energy, right? And it's spaces where Black people can go and feel joy and feel and see foods that are going to be familiar. Onions, tomatoes, squash, pigeon peas, purple hull peas, green beans. Here in the Black marketplace in North Carolina, there's a great video at the market down in Research Triangle where one of the folks says, if you want to know what a pocket of joy looks like, you want to come to a Black farmer's market, right? And so there's signs there that says, you're welcome, right? You belong here and we accept everyone here. There are, as you can see here, different kinds of prices like you might see in your local bodega, your local corner store, or your local neighborhood market. You're also going to see foods that you really do know what they are: muscadine, blueberry cider, and so forth, right? Squash, blackberries, bean pies. You know, if you live in areas where you are, where there are Muslim communities, you'll know what bean pies are. But other things are sold at most Black farmers markets, things like soaps and incense and syrups and honeys and clothes and pottery and things of that nature. They're not exclusive to Black farmers markets, but my point is you're also probably going to see children running around and you're going to see music. And here you see in the middle of this market, there's a whole basketball court, right? So I talk about what it means when we start talking about Black food culture. right? And why it becomes problematic to put these labels on folks, especially when you have situations where you have wealthy people who will go out every day and consume lots of alcohol, lots of food high on the hog. But when it comes down to Black folks eating foods that are familiar to us and good to us, we end up getting demonized, right? So I kind of close with this this comment from a study that was done at UC Davis many years ago, where they argue that in contemporary America, food spending rises with income, but that form of that additional spending is food away from home and other foods at the grocery store, right? So the more money you make, the more you're probably eating out, which leads me to question why we are demonizing people who eat however they can in the meantime. And so I'm going to close with these images here, where you see a variety of different foods, some of which are chicken, raw chicken, and things of that nature, a location that accepts food stamps. And just because it happens to be the Dollar Tree or the dollar store, which depending upon where you are, your dollar store could be full with fresh fruits and vegetables. I think we do ourselves and other people a disservice when we don't allow people to eat in the meantime. In the meantime, meaning while we're waiting to change the agro-industrial system, while we're waiting for folks to get access to good food, how do people eat in the meantime? So they can take their medication, so that they can gain the weight that they need, so that they can build community, all of those kinds of things. So I'm going to end there and open it up for conversation and questions, because I know we have about 15 minutes or so. And thank you all again for coming out. Questions or comments? Thank you very much. I think folks also have to be unmuted. I don't know if we want to mute them one by one, Sarah. It's up to you.
I'm hoping folks have the ability to unmute themselves.
Or unmute themselves. Okay.
Yeah, go right
Okay.
ahead.
Well, let me ask a question. Have any of you all encountered situations of food shaming? Never. No one. Not during holidays.
Well,
None of that.
maybe. Hi, this is Heather.
Hey.
I identify as a Chicana, and
Mhm.
so one of my favorite stories from my husband is that he said that he knew I was the woman for him when he saw me eating my chicharrones, real pig skins. So he said, "I'm gonna marry you." But
Good.
is a person that I've been have lupus and have been about a couple years now, so trying to eat a different way, not eating gluten or dairy, but trying to eat somewhat traditional also. And it's interesting, like corn is supposedly like a something that can affect my body or something like that. So like it's been, for me personally, it's been challenging trying to eat like my traditional foods of Mexican foods, but also in to be healthy, Whole30, for example, you're not supposed to eat gluten or dairy or corn, which corn is a big staple. So I don't know if it's necessarily food shaming, but I guess kind of going to what you're saying is clean eating. I do feel healthier, I guess, sometimes, but then it makes me trying to find ways to eat somewhat traditional foods like tortillas or something like that, and try to be healthy with my lupus. So, but I really like what you're thinking of eating your foods, traditional foods, because we all have those traditional foods.
Right. And I mean, healthy though gets defined in lots of different ways, or it should, right? Because what's healthy for you may not be healthy for me, or may in fact be healthier for me. And I think part of the challenge for all of us is when we talk about eating healthy foods, we don't take those nuances into account, right? We forget that you've got immigrant communities of all sorts for whom the caloric intake and count is different from American based foods. And then there's this thing called cultural sustainability, where people, especially when you have traveled or when you have relocated, one of the things you tend to look for are the foods of your home that remind you of home, right? So I can imagine the challenge you sometimes have, Heather, trying to, if for your comfort food may have to be different now because you can't go back to the foods perhaps that you grew up on or what have you that gave you that comfort because they may in fact affect your life in another kind of way. So there it is with, buy local, eat organic, eat this way, eat that way. We have to allow people the flexibility to eat in ways that are going to make them healthy and feel healthy, body, mind, and soul, right? So it's not just a one size fits all. And that's part of what I'm trying to get across in this book, that we have to open up these conversations so we're not so myopic and stuck in a single story that really actually ends up killing people.
Sorry, just one more point. As a foster parent, I appreciate you bringing up that point in the article because my husband and I have fostered a few children of Latinx, Latina, and so definitely see when you grow up in a family of or children that grow up in the area of trauma, that
Yeah.
definitely has an impact on them. So it's interesting how having access for those children to have access to healthier foods can help heal their bodies. And trying to do something in our local schools here in Albany, Oregon, working with the schools, teaching them about BIPOC children and especially those in foster care, that we really need to help support them compared to eating some of the foods that are available for foster children that are like high in sugar or crap that the schools offer. So thank you for
Right.
mentioning that.
Absolutely. I mean, when my daughter came to us at 2, she had lived trauma, and some of the first foods that we introduced to her are still very much today her comfort foods, fruit cups, Hawaiian rolls or what have you, King's Hawaiian rolls. One of her first meals in our home, turkey sausage and things of that nature. And so she grew up from that point forward with a very eclectic food palette. Her dad from Ghana, West Africa. So a lot of the food she eats are Ghanaian, right? And so she experienced some shaming around that because at first she used to take rice and sauce and, and people are like, what is that? Why does it smell like that? The typical kind of, thing. But what we have learned, and I'm still learning because she's 18 and I'm still learning about how trauma-induced experiences get reflected in food. Right. And so for me, when I read Latricia's story and I was talking with her about it, she was like, Mom, that may be the only place in time that she can feel comfortable is when she's cooking, and she's cooking foods that are familiar to her caregiver. And that may be a space in which they break down barriers and they have really good conversations and so forth. So we can't underestimate the power of food and stories surrounding food, and the ways that culture and cultural sustainability feeds into the foods that we eat. So it goes beyond healthy or not healthy, dirty or clean. Food is so powerful for the work that it does, both in satiating our bodies, but also our souls and our minds, because there are other things that are connected to that. So what I hear you saying is the need to introduce trauma in, sensitive foods to people to these young folks. And that could just be foods that are different or foods that may be, grapes, quite frankly, because they taste good, they feel good. Oh my gosh, kind of thing. And they can get access to those. So thank you for sharing that. We have like what, 4 or 5 more minutes? Any other thoughts or comments? You can purchase the book. Certainly you can get it through Amazon, but I would encourage you to get it from your local bookstore, your independent bookstore, or through UNC Press. It's an academic press, so I don't make a lot of money from these, but I do want the story to get out, and I want to share it with people about different ways to talk about food and food cultures, because we all do experience shaming, whether we recognize it or not. But as I said, in Black communities, we tend to have been living with it for a long time since our arrival on these shores.
I could think of a time when I probably shamed someone that I was a physician assistant and seeing this family, Latinx family, and the probably 3-year-old or 3 to 4-year-old was very heavy, and to the point where we were, having her evaluated maybe for some kind of endocrinologic issue maybe that she was dealing with, and that checked out negative. But when I actually talked, the family was, I would say I wasn't very sensitive maybe to the how protective they felt of her, and that they felt defensive, and when I got more of a history about her life and her routine and stuff, it taught me a lot. And one of the things that was happening was that she lived with several different folks in her family, different generations, and uncles and aunts and so forth, and people had different schedules and worked nights and worked different shifts. And so every time somebody would come home and have a meal, she would sit with them at the table. And, that was a lifestyle thing that was affecting her health in that way. But it was also part of the social, the health of the family, that she was participating in meals with her family.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And there's no real shame in that. I talk about this in the book, where I shamed a best friend of mine and roommate by laughing. I don't eat pork, and she had gone through great lengths to make this dish, and out of the 3 of us who came, only one of us ate pork. And after he tasted it, he said, "It tastes like kielbasa," and we all started laughing because it seemed kind of funny at the moment. But then later she said, "I worked really hard to prepare that dish," and my dad had saved it and sent it to me. And so we don't know when we're making these kinds of assessments of people's lives. And so, Peg, you bring up a lot of really good issues. This young girl was participating in the family culture, right? Of sitting at the table, which we want children to do. But at the same time, she's eating at every meal. And one parent or one relative may not know that she's doing this with, each relative. And so you've got those issues. You've got young people and old people who are taking medication. And so sometimes medication, puts added weight, especially if it's a steroid. My daughter went through that. She gained a lot of weight and became very self-conscious. So having a young person step on the scale and then putting their weight out in front of other people, I mean, the horror of that is just, and you would think an educator would know better, right? So all this to say, there are lots of different ways in which shaming happens. This is why I try to encourage us to stay away from these big labels like local, healthy, clean, eating right, how do we get people to stop doing X, Y, and Z? We don't know the food decisions that people make every day and the myriad challenges and nuances that go into these decisions that we make on an everyday basis. Thank
Mhm.
you all so much. I appreciate your coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
So much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. I was trying to read the chat.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for all the comments as well.